Win Anyway Live. Today it's Speaking Tip Tuesday, and I want to talk about stories. We all have stories, or we should have stories in the speeches that we give. The question is, why do we tell which stories? Well, you tell which stories on Halloween, of course. No, it's not close enough to Halloween for that joke to even be funny, right? No, which stories, not which stories. There are two main types of stories that we tell: personal stories about our own lives, things that have happened to us throughout our own personal history. Like I will talk about my experiences with my leg, with my limp, with letting go of my leg, with the super deluxe robot leg as I let go of my old original leg. Personal stories like that that have an impact. I'll tell stories about my times in contests when I haven't done as well as I would have liked, or sometimes when I have done well. Those are personal stories. Then you have third party stories, stories that aren't about you, they're about somebody else. Those are commonly thought of as the Steve Jobs story, or the Thomas Edison story, John F. Kennedy story about other people. Now, personally, I don't tell John F. Kennedy stories or Edison stories or Steve Jobs stories because people tell those stories all the time. I prefer third party stories that may be from people or companies or situations that people haven't heard of. So I try to keep an eye on the newspaper, on magazine articles. Well, technically, all of it is on the internet articles, stories about things that are happening in the world that would help support whatever point I'm trying to make in the speech that I'm giving at the moment. And then there's a type in the middle, and these aren't the only stories. There are several different types of stories that I'll probably go into in other podcasts, in other videos. The third party personal story is kind of in between, where you don't tell a personal story about you, but you tell about your parents or your grandparents or your best friend. When I talk about my grandpa Bob and how he wrote journals every day of his life, or I talk about my friend Jeff and his adventures in the film industry, those aren't personal stories, even though they are personal stories. So they're right in between third party stories and personal stories. So, why do we use any one of these types of stories? Well, a lot of it is dependent on your audience. See, when you go out and speak in the real world, your audience may or may not be all that tuned into who you are. You may not have built an incredible amount of credibility with them. Yes, you have credibility by the fact that you are there. You've built some credibility by having your name and description in the program, and you've been introduced, and you're the guy or gal on stage. But they haven't necessarily bought into you yet. So you might have this great point and this great pain that you're trying to solve for them with this set of solutions. But why should they believe you if you only tell stories about yourself? Because it might just work for you. You can't be the hero. You can't be that person on top of the mountain until they can see that what you are proposing, what you're talking about, has worked outside of you, has worked in the real world, has worked preferably in situations that mirror the situations that that audience is in. And so I strongly recommend using third party stories to help support the points that you're trying to make. And then after you've told those third party stories, and this is assuming you've got 30 to 40 minutes for a speech, then you go into your story, because then they're going to want to hear your story. They don't want just a book report. They want to hear from you. Okay, we're hearing, are you just telling us what you've observed, or are you hearing what you've gone through? That you've whet their appetite. You've basically opened the door for you to tell your own story that proves the points that you are trying to make, proves the solution that you are trying to give. Now, if you're already connected with your audience, like at Toastmasters, if you're in front of a bunch of friends, you can just give personal stories and nobody cares. That's what the International Speech Contest, for the most part, is all about. You're already connected. You're all Toastmasters. You're in a group. If you go to, if you're a Rotarian and you're giving a speech at your Rotary Club or at another Rotary Club, you're all one big happy family. If you are giving a talk at an industry event, you may not need to use as many third party stories as personal stories because you're already in with them. But you want to be able to take a look at who you're talking to and how much credibility you have with them when you balance out how many third party stories you tell before you get into your own story. Now, you never want to skip your own story. You are the speaker, you are important. You have to have some personal experience with the points you're making and the solution you're offering. So make sure that you never skip your own story. Just know, be intentional about what stories you're telling, whether they're true third party stories or third party stories about people in your circle, your family, your friends, which can be effective if you have at least one totally outside third party story to mix in and then get to your personal story. I'll start talking about some of the other stories in future weeks because they are important and you want to be able to understand what the difference is between the stories I just talked about and what the other stories are that I'll get into later. Everything has its place, and every approach has merit. And by the way, a lot of this I've read, particularly in, I believe it's called The Message of You by Judy Carter. This is a philosophy that she helped talk me into when I was listening to her book on Audible years ago. Talk to you tomorrow on, what is it, Weight Loss Wednesday here on Win Anyway Live.